Hey guys, and welcome back. Today we're going to build upon a topic I covered in May of last year. Back then, we created some single part molds and cast some really cool UV reactive buttons. The buttons turned out pretty good, but there were several downsides to using a single part mold, mainly being that you need to use a Dremel on the bottom of the button to make it feel more like the original. So today, let's take an in-depth look at a multi-part cast and create some very high quality buttons out of resin. So for this mold, we're going to be molding a set of N64 buttons. The beauty of this is N64 buttons aren't really remade by anybody, and I don't see any online that are easily obtainable, so it'll be nice to be able to custom create these. What you're seeing me use here is plastilinic clay. This is very important to make sure you get the right kind of clay. You need to have something that's sulfur-free. Now, having said that, you could very easily use something just like hot glue. However, the beauty of this is we'll use some of this plastilinic clay a little bit later on in the process, and on top of that, since it's oil-based, it really never dries out. So just something to keep in mind. You don't need it, but it's recommended. The gist of what I'm trying to achieve here is to go ahead and build a base to prop up the button on top of. And the goal here is to make the button as flush as possible on the bottom with the clay. So what I've done to do that is I've spread out the clay onto the base of my mold, and then I'm going to go ahead and push the button into it, and then you're seeing me use a little bit of a toothpick here to go ahead and kind of flatten it against the base of the button. The goal here is not to let any of the silicone, which we're going to pour later on, seep into the bottom of the button. If that does happen, there is ways to fix it later on, but it just requires a lot more time and effort, and you're better off spending time and effort up front so you don't have to spend it on the back end. So let's go ahead and get a few more of these buttons fixed onto the bottom of my mold here, and let's go ahead and get this mold box ready to go to pour some silicone. Okay, with the buttons all in there, it's time to go ahead and build up our mold box. So to do that, I'm using some corrugated plastic sheet. It's basically something I got from Home Depot. It was not that expensive. I think it was like $5 for a massive sheet. I mean, it's going to take me a really long time to use all this. But anyway, yeah, just going ahead and getting that all cut out. You can use scissors. I'm using a box cutter. Scissors are a better option. And then I'm going to go ahead and glue this up. You're just using some hot glue and affixing it to the base of the mold. And then it's time to hot glue every single inch and corner of this thing. Silicone is very expensive. Hot glue is very cheap. Your best bet is to overglue this thing so you don't end up having any silicone leak all over your table. Because if you do, it's honestly a very expensive mess. And even though silicone's pretty easy to clean up once it dries, it's expensive and it's a waste of money. So use more glue than necessary. Mold box is built. Time to go ahead and mix and pour some silicone. I'm using Umu 30 from Smooth On, and I personally really like this product simply for two main reasons. One, it really doesn't actually require any vacuum degassing. Now, I will be vacuum degassing it, but it doesn't actually require it. The other thing I really like about it is the pot life on it's pretty long, which is a really good thing because if you're choosing not to vacuum degas it, it means you'll have a longer amount of time for the bubbles to rise out of the product prior to pouring it. Also recommended by Cats, who I consider to be one of the premier button casters, is the MoldStar products from Smooth On, and specifically he recommends the MoldStar 30, 15, and 20T. Now, while I can't say I've tried those myself, the fact that he's recommending them probably means they're a high quality product. So this is a 1-to-1 mix ratio, so I've gone ahead and poured part A and part B into two separate cups of equal volume. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a third cup and pour both part A and part B into that cup and begin the mixing process. Whenever you're mixing silicone, it's always really important. You want to scrape the sides of the wall really, really well. Make sure you get the bottom of the cup, and what you should see is a combined really nice looking, purplish type color with this specific, blue and pink color combo. And you shouldn't see any streaks or anything like that. You want to make sure you have a nice uniform color, and that's how you'll know you'll be done. But like I said, important to get the sidewalls and the bottom of the cup with no streaks in there. Next, I'm going to vacuum degas the silicone. And the reason why is I really don't want any air bubbles in there. I want to make sure that I get as tight of a mold as possible, and vacuum degassing it is the way to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and start increasing the pressure in here, and what you're going to notice is as the pressure rises, so does the actual silicone itself. Now at some point it will hit equilibrium, and when it hits that equilibrium, it'll collapse upon itself, and then the air bubbles will just naturally rise out of it without the actual silicone itself rising. Sometimes you got to play with the air a little bit, let some in, let some out until you get it just about perfect. But normally what I've tended to notice is the cone will rise to about 3 times its original poured amount. So for example, if you have 1 ounce of silicone in there, you're going to need at least a 3-ounce cup to make sure that you have enough room for the silicone to expand during vacuum degassing. So here we are after about, I don't know, 6 to 8 minutes. You can see that there's basically no more bubbles coming up, and we're still pulling a full vacuum on the actual silicone itself. So with that in mind, I think it's time to go ahead and pull this thing out of here and start getting ready to do some pouring. So there's 2 things I like to keep in mind when I'm pouring my mold. The first being, you want to go ahead and hold the silicone from pretty high up and try to get a very thin stream. This will help pop any remaining bubbles, and it'll help everything kind of fuse together. The other thing is you want to keep your pour in one corner or in one part of the mold and allow the silicone to naturally allow itself to spread out. This will allow it to get in all the nooks and crannies, and you won't have to worry about trapping any more air bubbles. Really what it comes down to is air bubbles are your enemy in this process, and we want to take every precaution we can to make sure you don't get any. Alright, so 6 hours has passed, which is the approximate cure time for the UMU 30. So let's go ahead and undo this and take apart our mold. Now, one thing I will say here that I did not exercise that I probably should have is if you add a little bit of IPA to hot glue, it basically just falls apart and you can take apart your mold super easily. So I'm just sitting here ripping it apart with my bare hands, but if you want to make your life super easy, a little bit of IPA will go a long way. So with everything demolded, I'm going to go ahead and clean up my mold. And to do that, I'm basically just going to try to get rid of any remnant clay that might be left over. And to the extent that there's any silicone that kind of seeped underneath my buttons, which there was a little bit here, I'm going to go ahead and use a hobby knife to kind of scrape that off and get it out of there before I get ready to pour the next layer of this mold. It's important to have a clean mold because the cleaner the mold, the better the silicone is going to get in there. The better the silicone gets in there, the better the actual mold is going to turn out. And in this case, we want to make as high quality of a mold as possible. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time here just using some IPA and my hobby knife to make sure everything's really, really, really clean. Okay, now that we have a clean mold, it's time to go ahead and set up the sprues. And what's a sprue? A sprue is basically a channel through which the resin is going to go ahead and flow into our mold. And specifically what I'm looking to do here is create 2 to 3 sprues per part at the highest level of the part. And ultimately what we're going to do is we are going to inject, think of like injection molding, we are going to inject resin into one point, and all of the air in the mold will flow out through that other point. That's why it's important to make sure you get the high points here. The beauty of using something like buttons, the high point normally exists at the tabs on the end of the button to help them fit into the controller properly. So what we're going to use is a 2-part super glue. Now I know you're thinking, hey, super glue sounds like it might permanently stay on there, and the answer is it actually doesn't. So we're going to use a 2-part here. We're going to use super glue and we're going to use an adhesive promoter or bondar. And the reason why we want to do that is basically what will happen is as soon as you touch the 2 points together, once you've got the activator on one end and the super glue on the other, they will bond instantaneously. And this is important because otherwise you're going to be sitting there holding those pieces in place for a really long time, and it takes absolutely forever to do. So let's go ahead and get all the sprues set up here, and like I said, you want 2 to 3 high points per button. I think I ended up doing 2 here. I would actually recommend even 3 if you have the ability to do so, because it'll help get even more air out of the mold. And like I said, air and air bubbles are your enemy throughout this entire process. I also want to send a shout out to Roarke for helping me out with this. He does some awesome Game Boy mods. I'm going to go ahead and link his Twitter and his Facebook in the description below. And with all that sprue work done, it's time to go ahead and rebuild our mold box. To do that, we're going to reassemble the mold box in the exact same form and fashion that we had done previously. And my previous commentary still applies, where you want to make sure that you're using plenty of hot glue because, like I said, Hot glue is cheaper than silicone, so you don't end up having a silicone mess on your desk. The other thing that I like to do that I didn't show here is put a little bit of that Patalina clay, almost snake it, and run it along the inside between the corrugated plastic that we're using for our mold box and the original mold. This will help prevent any silicone from running between there. You can also use hot glue, which is actually what I did here, but for whatever it's worth, it's kind of messy, harder to do. I kind of think the Patalina clay is an easier route to go with. So one of the beauties of silicone is it really doesn't stick to anything except for other silicone. So what we're going to use is a silicone mold release, and I've just got some general purpose silicone mold release here that I'm going to use. I'm going to go ahead and spray this on there, and we're going to put about 3 or 4 coats on here. It's really important to make sure that you put a coat on, let it dry, put another coat on, let it dry, rinse and repeat 3 to 4 times. Trust me on this one, silicone molds don't release properly. You basically have a silicone block on your hands, which is absolutely worthless for what we're trying to accomplish here. So take your time, spray that mold release on there, and make sure you get 2 to 3 very solid coats. Anyway, let's go ahead and mix up this next batch of silicone, vacuum degas it, and get ready to pour it into our mold. After 6 hours, mold should be ready to go. And now I'm going to use some needle nose pliers over here to pull out all the sprues that we had previously created. And these actually come out really easily. You just kind of give them a tug with the needle nose and they come right out. And even better, they actually take the super glue right along with them. So like I said, easy cleanup there, no worries. You can drop the buttons that you used for your mold right back into your existing controller and you're good to go. After that, we're going to go ahead and take the mold box apart, and same rules apply as before. IPA makes your life easier, or you can do what I did and just tear it absolutely open. Finally, I kind of caution you on this last part when you're separating the 2 mold halves. You know, I'm making it look pretty easy here because I'm cutting and clipping around, but you're going to want to take your time, go really slow, and not rip your silicone in any way, shape, or form. But you can see the 2 halves of the mold box turned out pretty well, and I got really good impression on both sides. So the last thing I'm going to do is take my hobby knife and clean up my mold box. And the other thing I'm going to do, and I'm going to take some time to do this, is make sure that I kind of widen or make a mouth on the sprues. And I only want to do it for 1 sprue per button. The reason why is because it'll help me when it comes time to the resin pouring a little bit later on, or should I say resin injecting a little bit later on, is that it'll help me keep track of which buttons I've injected resin into and which ones I haven't. Okay, we're almost at my favorite part, which is going to be injecting the resin. But before we get to that, what I'm going to do right here, what I did off camera at least, is I did spray some of the mold release in here prior to adding these rubber bands to it. And the only reason I'm doing that is to kind of keep my mold shut. Realistically, what you'd probably want to do is use 2 pieces of the plastic corrugated box that I used for the mold earlier. But considering the fact that there's a ton of sprues at the top, it's just easier to do it the way I'm doing it, even though it's not absolutely perfect. The resin I'm using is an epoxy-based resin. This is Art and Glow. The reason why I personally like this is it has a really long open time of approximately 45 minutes. The only downside to that is it's a 24-hour demold time and a 48-hour cure time. So it is a little bit of a downside there, but like I said, and you'll understand more here in a minute why this is an ideal choice for me. So full disclosure, this is not the right way to do this. However, sometimes you just got to work with the tools that you have at hand. The real way to do this right would be to have a pressure pot. However, I don't actually own one, so what I'm doing is vacuum degassing my resin. Now, this is, again, not something you would typically do, but it's the best way that I can think of to get air bubbles out, so when I inject the resin into the molds, I don't get bubbles. So as previously noted, we've got those sprues. We're going to inject the resin into the sprue, and you're going to see the resin flow out of the air outlet. That's a good thing. That's exactly what you want. One other thing to note, if you go with the syringes that I've recommended in the description below, there is a needle attached to them. You need to actually pull that needle out with a pair of needle nose pliers. It's really easy to do, but just something I thought I'd mention. Well, it's been a solid 48 hours. Time to pull these things out of the molds. You can see they turned out really, really nice. Getting a nice look at those buttons right now. You will notice from time to time you'll get some flashing on these, and honestly it's no big deal. Usually what I do is I just take my hobby knife and run it around the edge of the button along the very bottom, and all that flashing will come out. You can also use this to make sure that it'll fit into the controller in case you got a little bit of, excess on one of the pegs or anything like that, so it's a nice smooth sliding button. With everything out of the molds, only one thing left to do. Time to admire those buttons and see how they work in your controller. So I ended up molding up a couple different sets, some N64s, some Sega Saturns, and some Nintendo Switch ones as well. As you can see, they all turned out pretty nice, but I said they glow, right? Yeah, they glow pretty damn well, I'd say. Here's a few other sets that I didn't do in this video, obviously, but I casted elsewhere. Just thought I'd show them off. I realize the color might not be for everybody, but hey, at the end of the day, you can pick whatever you want to do, and you can add any effects that you want, whether it be pearlescent, glitter, tinsel, whatever you want to kind of really spice it up and make it unique and your own. With all that being said, guys, I want to thank you very much for watching. I really hope that this was informative and helpful, and if some of you guys give it a shot, please share whatever you make with me on Twitter. Anyways, I'll see you for the next one here soon.